So recently, a lot of people have been trying out Pathfinder 2nd Edition for what I will say are various reasons. But it's also because of this that I've been running a lot of game sessions or adventures specifically gauged towards introducing new game masters and players alike to Pathfinder 2nd Edition by showcasing some of the big features that I really like, or more so the pros for playing the system. And it's also because of this that I've had a lot of game masters and players alike approach me, whether it be before, during, or after a game session, and say to me, okay, so Nate, honestly, what are some of the biggest flaws for the game system in your opinion? Like, what are some of the things you don't like about Pathfinder 2nd Edition that you wish you could change, or some things that we should look out for when we decide to switch? And it's because of that I wanted to make this video. So, hello, my name is Nate Munn, and in this video we're going to be talking about the 8 things that players and GMs do not like about Pathfinder 2nd Edition. In this video, I'm going to be talking about a lot of points and opinions from my players and other game masters, as well as myself, that they have pointed out to me or I have noticed about Pathfinder 2nd Edition that I would consider or they would consider to be some flaws or things that they don't really like. And let me just be clear, I still really enjoy Pathfinder, and I think that these cons, honestly, do not outweigh the pros for at least trying out or playing the game system. But without further delay, let's jump right in, starting off with number 8. Combat is pretty complex. So combat for Pathfinder 2nd Edition is honestly one of the most debated topics for the game, or at least in my humble opinion, because it's such a focus for the game system. So if a lot of players enter into the game without realizing that, or perhaps don't know what they're signing up for, then this is the reason why a lot of players are sure to point it out that they either don't like it or wish they could change some aspects of it. I've had players point out that there are way too many actions for you to take during combat, which leads to the player feeling overwhelmed. And I've also had players point out that combat takes too long because players spend so much time trying to go over all of their feats, class abilities, and actions to try to pick the correct one for every single action that they take on their turn. I've also had a lot of players get upset at the average difficulty for encounters, because generally a lot of encounters in Pathfinder 2nd Edition are going to be more deadly than they would be in other game systems, just with the way that the monsters and the crit system is currently designed. Because when a group of player characters come across a combat encounter that has the same amount or more enemies in the party, then that generally means it's going to be a fairly difficult encounter. And it's because of this that strategy and teamwork is a must if you want to survive an encounter. And it's also because of this and a 3-action economy system that going off by yourself in a dungeon or trying to scout ahead of the party can be very dangerous and deadly if you're not too careful. This is because most monsters are fairly powerful and can be very deadly if you're not too careful, which means that you have to be more strategic during combat and work as a team, as opposed to other game systems where you can kind of get away with not working as a team quite as much as you need to in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. And if you don't work as a team and don't consider the strength of your enemies and their potential to crit you or just outright kill you in a single turn because of Pathfinder 2nd Edition's new crit system, then dying or at least going down in combat can become a very common occurrence. But one other very divisive mechanic or feature of the game system is the topic of my next point, which is number 7, secret checks. So for those of you who don't know, secret checks are checks that the GM makes for the player regarding a certain action that the player wants their character to take. And some of these actions include things such as perception checks, stealthing, lying, trying to determine if someone is lying, etc., etc. And as I just showed you, a lot of checks in Pathfinder 2nd Edition have the secret trait, which means that they are rolled privately by the GM and they don't tell you what the outcome is. They more so just describe to you the scenario and what you learn, and you have to take that at face value, and you don't know if you rolled a critical miss or a critical success or somewhere in between. But this is the reason why this particular mechanic is so divisive, because a lot of players don't like having their checks made secretly by the GM and the player not knowing what the outcome was. Meanwhile, others appreciate the purpose for this mechanic, which is that it's meant to prevent metagaming information that technically you wouldn't know. So in other game systems, if you as a player know that you rolled really high on an insight check, you can pretty much assume that the information that you learned from the insight check is going to be correct. Meanwhile, with Pathfinder 2nd Edition, if you make a sense motive check, which is basically Pathfinder 2nd Edition's equivalent of an insight check, the GM makes it for you and tells you what you learn. So, like I said before, you have to take that information at face value and hope that you rolled high enough to get useful information that is both true and accurate to the situation. And as I showed you previously, there are a lot of actions that are made secretly by the GM that the players technically aren't supposed to make. And again, you can quickly fix this with a house rule, but mechanically that is the purpose for it, and a lot of things that players don't like about Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Because, as I'm sure you may have noticed, some of the most common roles in a TTRPG, such as perception and stealth, are almost always made secretly by the GM. meaning that the players don't get to roll for those. But the annoyance that perhaps is creeping across the face of your players in regards to secret checks is really nothing when compared to new players when they see the topic of my next point, which is number 6, the character sheet. Oh my Lanta, this character sheet is insane, and I have honestly no real idea how you're supposed to pitch the game system to a new player by showing them the character sheet, because this thing is insane to look at. Luckily, most of my sessions are online, so I use a VTT to take care of the character sheet information automatically. But if you're running an in-person game, then you might default to using a physical character sheet because that's how the game is meant to be played, right? But when you compare Pathfinder 2nd Edition's character sheet to D&D's character sheet, you can immediately tell that there is a lot more going on and there is a lot more fields that you need to fill out depending upon your level and what your character currently possesses in terms of items, feats, and yada yada yada. You get the point. But I've had players and game masters express to me that one of the biggest reasons why they didn't try out Pathfinder 2nd Edition or Pathfinder 1st Edition sooner was because they saw or looked up a character sheet for it and immediately thought to themselves, okay, that is way too complicated, I am never coming back or I'm not going to try it out. And I completely understand why. Because at a glance, when looking at this well-designed yet complicated-looking character sheet, when you're perhaps more accustomed to looking at D&D's simple and easy-to-understand character sheet, it all seems a bit overwhelming, especially if you're a brand new player to TTRPGs or new to Pathfinder 2nd Edition entirely. And while I do primarily run all of my games online and use a VTT, I've had a lot of people try out Pathfinder and VTTs for the first time in my game sessions, and they've told me before, like, oh my gosh, man, this is way better. I tried playing Pathfinder 2nd Edition in person and it was a massive hassle because I needed to spend at least 30 minutes before the game session filling out my character sheet and trying to figure out what all my modifiers were and all that kind of stuff. Meanwhile, with the VTT, it takes care of all of that for you. But like I was saying earlier, if you're going to be running a Pathfinder 2nd Edition game in person, one of the biggest cons can be the character sheet if you're not using a digital tool like Path Builder or a VTT to take care of all of the modifiers and everything for you. Because every single time you change an ability score or gain a new skill proficiency or something, you have to change all of those modifiers on the character sheet, which could be multiple fields that you have to erase and then change and so forth. And for a lot of players, that can be a massive turnoff to the system and may mean they don't even play the system entirely because they don't want to have to deal with modifying all that kind of stuff, which I completely understand. But while a lot of players see this as a massive con for the system because of how complicated the character sheet is, like I said before, if you're playing on a VTT, like Foundry VTT for example, which I talk about in this video, then it takes care of all of that for you and runs super well and smoothly, or at least in my opinion. But regardless of where you keep your character sheet information, whether it be on a physical character sheet or perhaps a digital tool, or maybe using a VTT like Foundry for example, you have to still admit that there is a lot of information that the players have to keep track of, and a new player especially may take one look at the character sheet and think to themselves, wait, what the heck? There's a field for my shield HP? Which is actually a great point to talk about, which leads me to point number 5 on my list. Shields are kind of a joke, or at least at earlier levels. Early level shields are pretty much useless in regards to the shield block ability until you can find or purchase a better shield. But even then, if it breaks, you have to fork over more coin to fix it or attempt to fix it yourself using a repair kit or something. And I'm sure you already know this, but shields are a massive part of most martial class builds, whether it be you're a champion or a fighter or some other class that wants to implement a shield of some kind. But the sad truth of the matter is, at earlier levels, shields break a lot, which means that you have to spend a lot of money trying to repair them, which means that if you don't want to do that and don't want your shields to be breaking, you pretty much never use the shield block ability or action. And like I said earlier, because of how often shields break, a lot of money is spent by martial characters in order to repair their current shield or just entirely buy a new one. So let's actually continue that thought for a second here and think for a moment if, for example, you are a martial character, right? And you want to use your shield block ability, but you want to upgrade your shield to a much better one. So you upgrade from wood to steel or from steel to cold iron or something like that, right? And by doing so, you spend a considerable amount of gold to upgrade your shield, which is a pretty core part of your build. Well, it can feel pretty disheartening when later that session or maybe next session, you decide to use your shield block action or ability, and by doing so after 1 or 2 attacks from the monster or the boss or whatever, it breaks, thus throwing all of that gold down the drain. Now obviously that's the give and take of using a shield, and specifically taking the shield block reaction. But for a lot of experienced players, they don't even use this at the earlier levels, but if you're a newer player, you may see this ability and instantly use it and not even realize the consequences, and then once your shield breaks, you immediately realize that it's not worth using that ability until you get a better shield. Because that player wanted to be the bulwark or the juggernaut by moving in front of the party and using their shield to defend their allies, but then after a single attack from a kobold, it then breaks, if that makes sense. At least, this idea is more so thinking of like the earlier levels. Towards the middle and later levels, it becomes much more manageable once you get access to more gold and things like that. But even still, a lot of players have pointed this out to me, that they feel like this particular feature is a little lackluster or feels pretty bad because it means that the martial characters who like to use shields have to use a lot of their gold going towards their shield. This combined with the fact towards the middle or later levels of the game, if you decide to spend a lot of gold buffing your shield, right, by giving it runes or purchasing a very expensive shield that's made out of a very valuable material, and then you decide to use it against a boss or in a boss encounter or whatever, and they may hit you multiple times or a monster may hit it multiple times and you can't repair it because you're in a dungeon or something, then maybe it breaks from that monster attack or from that boss attack, which can feel very bad because again, all that gold goes down the drain. And speaking of buffing your equipment and armor and monster attacks and all that kind of stuff, this leads me to my next point, which is number 4, big numbers and modifiers. So for a lot of players, this can actually be a very big pro for the system, or something that a lot of players really like about the system, especially if you're a min-maxer who thrives in combat and really likes seeing all the modifiers and damage you deal during combat. But in my experience, and with what my players have shared with me, this can be a pretty big con for the system, especially if you're not running the game on a VTT like Foundry, for example, that takes care of all of that number crunching for you. And the reason why I say this is because there are so many modifiers, penalties, and statuses that are involved in ability checks, skill checks, and combat that a game session can get really bogged down or slowed down just by trying to calculate it all, especially at higher levels. So if you're running your game in person and not using a VTT to take care of all of the modifiers and math for you, then that means that combat could become a huge drag if you aren't quick on your mathematical feet. Because during combat, or in a situation where a player wants to attack something or maybe roll for something, each player has to calculate all of the bonuses that they get from their ability scores, then their weapons, then their feats, then their skill or proficiency bonuses, and then take into account any penalties that you or your enemy has, and then finally take into account any conditions that are in play, and then finally determine if your attack hits or not. And then after all of that work, you may just end up not hitting, so it feels like you really didn't accomplish anything besides doing some math, I guess, if that makes sense. And especially if you're in a physical game, it can feel pretty bad when you're a player and constantly trying to throw these attack rolls and your game master or other players are like, oh, don't forget that he's also flat-footed, so there's a penalty to that. Oh, and technically you're also frightened, so you have a -1 to that, and all this other kind of stuff. And it's like, just let me roll my dice and let me hit, please. And for us experienced players, we may think it's not that big of a deal to add in some extra penalties or modifiers, and some of us, the min-maxers, may be very excited to add some of those in. But sadly, for newer players, it can be very overwhelming. And with the way that the system is currently designed in terms of its critical hit/critical miss system, all of those modifiers that are added in are extremely important because that +1 that you got from guidance could be the determining factor in whether your attack was a critical or not. So as you can see, this can be a very big con for newer players or for people who are trying out Pathfinder 2nd Edition, especially if they're a newer player and especially if they're not using a VTT, because they get caught up in all of the tangled knots of mathematics and calculations that they lose the entire picture that the game master is trying to paint in terms of the campaign and maybe the encounter overall. Which leads me to my next point, which is number 3. Theater of the mind with Pathfinder is difficult. So if you're a game master or a player that really enjoys theater of the mind campaigns, where physical battle maps and miniatures aren't really a thing and everything takes place in your imagination, where your GM can paint the scene for you, well, it may be pretty difficult to do that using Pathfinder 2nd Edition without foregoing or removing a couple of rules, or at least in my humble opinion. And the reason why I say this is because with my experience, with how many rules there are in Pathfinder 2nd Edition that cover distance, your degree of detection, the conditions, the AoE effects, and all the other kind of stuff, trying to do a Theater of the Mind campaign or encounter becomes a lot more difficult than it normally would if you were using a less rules-dense system. But of course, like with any TTRPG, the rules are more of guidelines, and those rules can be easily tossed out if you don't want to use them. But the issue with doing that when playing Pathfinder 2nd Edition is that the system was designed with the idea that most of the core rules and features will be used or implemented in one way or another. And it's because of this that trying to run a theater of the mind game can be pretty tricky, because you have to be careful with what rules you decide to forego or completely remove to make your theater of the mind game session run smoothly. And the reason why I say this is because you could potentially destabilize the balancing of the game system if you just entirely rip out entire rule sets. Meanwhile, with other game systems, that's not really too much of a worry. And in my humble opinion, and in my experience with running Pathfinder 2nd Edition games, running a Theater of the Mind encounter or campaign can be very difficult, specifically because of Pathfinder 2nd Edition's rules regarding detection, movement speed, and player abilities and features and all the other kind of stuff, and it can become a huge hassle when you're having to keep track of all of the conditions and penalties and so forth on a sheet of paper in regards to the monsters as well as the players. But let's actually talk about that by moving on to number 2 on my list, conditions. There is a lot of record and stat keeping that needs to occur just from conditions alone with Pathfinder 2nd Edition, as opposed to other game systems like D&D 5e, for example. So I don't know if you know this, but Pathfinder 2nd Edition has 42 different conditions that all have different ways to interact with other conditions, the players, features, the world around them, and other rules. It is insane. So let's back up a little bit and think about that for a second. 42 different conditions. That is insane. And it's even more insane when you take into account that some of the conditions have different degrees to them. So for example, you can be slowed 1, but you can also be slowed 3, which could then add a different condition onto you based off of that particular condition's degree. And there are different conditions that can be imposed, or degrees of poisons, I should say, which is crazy to think about. So to compare Pathfinder 2nd Edition to D&D 5e again, because they're always butting heads nowadays, D&D only has 14 conditions, so that's a pretty big difference. However, as opposed to other TTRPGs, Pathfinder 2nd Edition has different types or groups of conditions. There are conditions for attitudes, death and dying, your degree of detection, lowered abilities, and your senses. But that's kind of a side note to my main point, which is that there are so many conditions in Pathfinder 2nd Edition that it can be mind-boggling as a game master to truly try and remember what all of them do, and if they impose a penalty, what that penalty is, as well as trying to remember to implement them on a player or monster's turn, especially if you're running a game physically and not letting a VTT take care of all of that for you. So if you're running a physical game, keeping track of conditions and the degree of that condition can be extremely tricky, especially if you have multiple enemies on the battlefield and each of them have a different condition affecting them. And it's because of this that if you're a game master or even a player, you can get very quickly overwhelmed by how many conditions there are. And if a condition is applied to you, does that apply another condition? Like for prone, for example, if you fall prone, you also become flat-footed. And if you're flat-footed or prone, what actions can you take and what actions can't you take? And if you have the flat-footed or prone condition, does that apply a penalty? And if so, what is the penalty? So you as the game master or even the player can get completely submerged in the quicksand that are the paragraphs of descriptions for features, abilities, conditions, and the like. Or if you're the game master or even a player, you can get lost in the jungle and knots and thorns that are the rules for the game system. Which is what leads me to point number 1 on my list. So much to read, so many rules, and so little time. So I've kind of mentioned this point in other videos of mine, but the size of the core rulebook for Pathfinder 2nd Edition is a huge disincentivizer, or disincentive I guess, for newer players who are trying to try out a TTRPG system. And trust me, I know that the core rulebook is so big because it contains all of the core rules for Pathfinder 2nd Edition in one massive book, hence the name Core Rulebook. Meanwhile, other game systems may opt to split those rules up into multiple books. But you still have to admit that if you're a newer player and you're just walking into a game store looking to try out a new TTRPG system, or looking to just get into TTRPGs in general, and you see all of them lined up on the bookshelf and you see Pathfinder Core Rulebook lined up against, you see the Pathfinder Core Rulebook lined up against all of the other rulebooks for other game systems like D&D, Call of Cthulhu, and so forth, it looks a lot bigger than the rest, and so you may think to yourself, okay, bigger, more complicated, smaller, easier to play, which in a lot of cases would make sense and is true. But you have to admit, if you step into the shoes of a brand new player and this tome of knowledge is currently sitting on the shelf next to other thinner and simpler looking books, you'll probably opt for the smaller ones because they seem more beginner friendly. And that's kinda true, because Pathfinder 2nd Edition is pretty complicated, especially compared to other TTRPGs in the space. But also, when it comes to abilities, features, spells, and all the other kind of stuff in the game, there is just generally a lot more rules and information that goes into them than other systems. While many people who play Pathfinder 2nd Edition see this as an actual pro for the system as opposed to a con, because it means that there isn't very much vaguity when it comes to the rules, because Paizo has taken the time to explain features, conditions, and spells in detail, it can also mean that if you're a new game master or a new player, a lot more time is spent reading about features, spells, or rules in general than other game systems. So taking the first level spell, Heal for example, look at all this text and different ways the spell can be cast. Pretty cool, right? But now look at D&D 5e's closest equivalent, which would be Healing Word. The difference in rule density is huge, and obviously this doesn't apply to every spell or feature that Pathfinder has, but generally this same theme continues with a lot of the feats, spells, and class abilities that are in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. And it's because of this that many game masters and players alike see how much more rules dense Pathfinder is when compared to other TTRPG systems, and immediately dislike the system because of how much time is required to familiarize yourself with all of the rules, terminology, conditions, as well as the other points I've talked about in this video. Pathfinder 2nd Edition has a lot more rules than most other TTRPG game systems, and that's just a fact. And it's because of this that a lot of players don't like the game system. That, but also Pathfinder 2nd Edition's main focus from a gameplay standpoint is combat. And it's because of this that a lot of features, spells, abilities, and mechanics are designed with that focus in mind, which doesn't appeal to a lot of players. And one of the biggest things that players and GMs love and hate about the system is how complex it can be. So as I hope you can see through most of, if not all of the points that I've shared with you in this video, the con of the game system, the biggest one in my humble opinion, and with all the opinions from my players and other game masters I've ran the game for and introduced to the game, is that it is very rules dense, and there is a lot of reading and a lot of, in general, rules that go into the game system. And it's because of this that many players don't like the system. So as I hope you can tell from some of the points I've made in this video, if not all of the points, is that Pathfinder 2nd Edition is a very complicated system, and it's because of this that a lot of players do not like to play it. Because there is a lot of time and effort that goes into reading the descriptions for things, learning how to play the game, as well as the conditions and everything else that goes into the mechanics of combat and so forth. And it's the reason why generally, if you're going to be playing Pathfinder 2nd Edition in a physical sense, with no tools to aid you in keeping track of all the conditions and ability modifiers and your attack modifiers and all that other kind of stuff, it can be very difficult. But there are also a lot of things that players and game masters love about Pathfinder 2nd Edition, so if you want to hear about some of those, I'll be sure to link in the description down below a video of mine that talks about the things that players and game masters love about Pathfinder. But with that everybody, thank you so much for watching, and if you liked the video or enjoyed it, consider leaving a like, and also leave a comment down below with your thoughts on the video or some of the points that I mentioned, or perhaps if I missed a particular con or thing that you don't like about Pathfinder, feel free to drop that in the comments down below as well. But as always, I'll catch you guys in the next video. Take it easy, bye bye.